and welcome to Communication Steroids, the podcast. I'm Roger Pike, and with me, as always, is the great Tim Gordon.
Just call me Gonzo. Most of my friends do, but you don't. So
I don't. I have never have. I don't know why. Everybody else does. But.
Well, you and I go back to radio, but we did news together, where that was not a nickname that I was using. But previously, in like my top 40 oldies disc jockey life, everybody knew me as Tim Gonzo Gordon, and they all said, "Hey, Gonzo, come here, Gonzo this, Gonzo that." You know, I was the fetch it, Gonzo. But that's what they called me, and to this day, people that I haven't worked with for 20 years, when I call them up, they'll say, "Hey, Gonzo, how's it going?" I mean, it's kind of funny.
You know what we have just done?
I don't.
We've told a story.
You're exactly right, and that's what we're talking about today on this Communication Steroids podcast. What do we do with stories in speeches, Roger?
Well, stories personalize a speech, and it helps you to make a connection with the audience. It can illustrate a point, but more importantly than anything else, I think stories invite the listener to pay attention. When you start to tell a story, people immediately become interesting. So the point is once you start telling a story, make it an interesting story.
Make it a good story.
Make it a good story.
Yeah, I mean, that's you can start a story with anything as simple as, well, once upon a time.
Yeah. I actually opened a speech that I won a championship with, a story about my grandmother. And in fact, the speech was called "My Grandmother's Eyes," and it did very well. And
and you can build speeches around stories. You can use a short story to illustrate a point, because the fact is, you can talk about facts and figures and demonstrate something and show them something with a big presentation, like a PowerPoint slide or something, but when someone walks away from your presentation, they'll remember a story you told much more than they'll remember that 3.2% of the population wears hats.
You can literally captivate your audience by telling them a story.
There are a number of stories that I've told that sort of my life stories that come up. Like there was one time, we've discussed this, some of the stories that we've had. Mm-hmm. You talked about your grandmother's eyes. I mean, when I was 25 years old, I was in a dead-end job and didn't like it and wanted to get out, and I needed to go find myself. So actually, I went up to Mount Jefferson in Central Oregon, spent 3 days camping there, and one of those days I climbed half the mountain by myself. I just walked up the mountain because there was trails and scrambling over rocks and when I got up there, and I was about a third of the way up the mountain from where you could see, and I thought, I'm not going to just go straight back down. I've got plenty of time. The day's young. So I started walking around the mountain a little bit, and I don't know how far I walked, a half a mile, and came down another area, and I got halfway down, and I realized that maybe I shouldn't have done that. I was in the middle of this entire hillside of rocks, boulders that were 20-ton boulders, and I thought, geez, if I upset one, they're all coming down, and I'm in the middle of this. This is not good. So all of a sudden, I realized I need to be very gingerly getting down. So I got down to the bottom there, and then I saw where my camp was, another mile away. I'd hike back, and I went through just bushes and brambles, and it was like, what am I doing here? And it was a very interesting experience. I remember that very vividly, and to me, it helps illustrate some of the things we get into.
Now, when you use that story, did you use it just to establish a bond with your audience? Did you use it just to get them to listen to you, or to pay attention to you, or did it illustrate a point that you were making in the speech?
It could be used for a couple things. It could illustrate a point of sort of a watershed moment in my life that I remember that I sort of climbed, went to the mountaintop to sort of find myself, and it's a very sort of cliche thing to do, but the fact that I personally did it and had some interesting things that go along with it made it a story worthwhile. Another story that I've told is that I met my childhood hero for 10 seconds one time by accident.
And which of the many childhood heroes was this? And please, don't make it me.
No, it wasn't. It was the lead singer for Paul Revere and the Raiders, Mark Lindsay, the guy with the ponytail. I was a kid, and I thought he was cool because he sang well, and he was from the Northwest, like we are, and years later, I was working at a radio station in Portland on a weekend shift, and no one was there at the station. And a guy that was a former manager of the Raiders back in the 60s was a sales guy at the shop. And he walked in, and Mark Lindsay was with him. And he said, "I want you to meet Mark Lindsay." And I went, "Hey, Mark, how you doing?" I said, "Hang on a second. My song is about over. I have to do a commercial set." And so I had to hit the mic. I mean, I couldn't stop. I was on the air. I mean, it was all preordained. I went on the air. I said, and so he starts walking out the door, and Roger did. And I had to stay in there for the 5 minutes that the commercial set was on. So as soon as it was over, I went out to the sales room. They were gone. I met my childhood hero for
10 seconds.
10 seconds.
Yeah. There are a number of different varieties and kinds of stories, and the first variety and kind of the story is the true story versus the not true story. You do not have, when you're using stories and speeches, they don't have to be true. Now, and then there are personal and not personal stories.
Right. Yeah. But no, you're right. A story. I mean, Jesus told parables. He demonstrated things with stories. It goes back thousands of years. The idea of telling a story in your presentation to really hook people in. And you're right. It gives the people a better chance to pay attention. It personalizes things, and you're right, it doesn't have to be your story. It helps if it's not the same story they've heard from 20 other speakers over the years, because that makes you look like you're not being original.
Right.
An original story certainly helps. A personal story that demonstrates a great point helps as well.
But if you can dig down into the archives and annals of stories and come up with one and maybe add some personalizing touches to it, you can use other people's stories. I like to use stories. I use stories in every single public speech, particularly every competitive public speech. I used to, and still do to some extent, speak competitively, where you go in front of an audience of evaluators and they evaluate your speech, and there are winners and there are losers. And sometimes I've won, and sometimes I have been robbed.
Yeah.
But the point being is that I like to use a story, and one of the stories that I've told, and I use this to demonstrate the nature of heroism, to talk about the nature of heroism. The speech was about heroism, and it was an attempt to define it, and it was attempted to define it in our personal lives, and this was a true story. It happened to me. I was on the beach at Lincoln City at the Lincoln City Kite Festival one year, and I don't know if you've ever been there, but it's a wonderful thing. There are literally hundreds, dozens of kites in the air of all shapes and sizes and all hues and all presentations, and it's beautiful. But there was a crowd gathered at one end of the beach, and and they weren't looking up at the sky; they were looking down at the ground. So my wife and daughter and I walked over to the crowd, and we looked down, and there in the middle of the sand, about 20 feet up on the beach, was a shark.
A shark.
A shark. A beached shark. Now, it was a shark on the smallish side, but it was still a 3-foot shark.
Yes.
So, and they were all oohing and eyeing over this shark on the ground, and I knew it was going to die. So we were, I was gathering up my wife and daughter to take them away from this so that we could go back to watching the beautiful kites. And my daughter looks up at me, and she's about 7,
right,
6 or 7, and she looks up at me, and her eyes are huge, and they're full of tears, and she said, "Daddy, put it back in the water."
Boy, that put you on the spot, didn't it?
It did, and I didn't know what to do. I looked down at her, and I said, "Hon, it's sick. It's probably not going to make it." And she said, "Put it back in the water." So I went over to the shark, which was lying there. I grabbed it by the tail and drug it into the surf and did two or three spins just to build up momentum, and flung it. Then I beat feet out of the water in case the water did in fact revive it, and it decided to take a bite out of its benefactor. I used this story because when I came back onto the land, some girl I didn't know, some young woman, came up to me, kissed me on the cheek, and whispered in my ear. She said, "You're a hero." And that has stayed with me all these years.
That kind of thing would. So that's a great story. That's a great demonstration. Your daughter, I'm sure, remembers that.
Mm-hmm.
You certainly remember that. Yeah. I would suggest, and this has been suggested before, to compile your own stories and start a file, make a list, come up with 50 stories.
Things have happened to you that you can render in a light that will help you illustrate your points.
And they don't have to be huge, life-changing events. They can be small things that just kind of help illustrate and define some of your points. So,
but make not a list, make a notebook of your stories that you can use in your speeches.
Roger, thanks again.
Well, and I was just about to say the very same thing to you since I'm hosting this particular podcast. Tim, it's always a pleasure being with you.
It's Communications Steroids, the podcast. I'm Tim Gordon.
And I'm Roger Pike.
Good night.